Throughout this unit, we're going to be primarily focused on valid arguments, identifying when arguments are valid, and looking at the structure of valid reasoning. However, at this point, we want to take a moment and talk about reasoning that is not valid. An argument that is not valid is called fallacious. Now, sometimes you'll see an argument that's not valid and you'll just look at it and say, what even is this nonsense? But often, a fallacious argument will follow one of several standard forms. A type or form of invalid argument is called a fallacy. Now, keep in mind, it's not that someone sits down to write an argument and sets out to commit these fallacies. These are much more classifications of arguments you might meet in the wild, rather than something that someone writes an argument to fit most of the time. And so sometimes you'll see something that looks more or less like a form but doesn't fit it perfectly. Our goal here is not necessarily to become perfect at classifying fallacies, but rather to recognize some common ones when we see them. Now, there are lots of logical fallacies. You could write a whole book on logical fallacies. You could take an entire course that did nothing but discuss logical fallacies. We're only going to discuss a few of them in this class. The easiest ones to spot in a lot of ways are deductive fallacies. By the end of this unit, you will be able to pin down and capture any deductive fallacy that you encounter. We're also going to see just a few inductive fallacies at the very end of the unit, which will raise some questions that will lead us into our discussion of statistics. But there are also some fallacies where you can't even really pin down the reasoning as deductive or inductive because they're just kind of talking in circles. We call these rhetorical fallacies. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. We often encounter rhetorical fallacies in the news, in media, on Twitter. And so being able to recognize these when we encounter them is incredibly useful. Now, as we look at these rhetorical fallacies, please keep in mind, just because an argument is not valid, that does not make its conclusion false. The conclusion of an argument might be true, regardless of the quality of the argument. So you can't say, oh, this person just used a fallacy. The thing that they're trying to convince me of can't possibly be true. On the other hand, you should find them unconvincing. All right, we are going to be spending some time classifying fallacies here. And to help you organize the fallacies that we're going to learn, we're going to divide them into some categories. Our goal is not to learn the categories, but to learn the fallacies. However, having these categories to help us organize our thoughts can be helpful in remembering. So we have three categories of fallacies we're going to talk about here. We have some fallacies of relevance. These arguments are not valid because they have premises that are just not related to the conclusion at all. So the premises are disconnected from the conclusion in a fallacy of relevance. We have some fallacies of misinterpretation, where the person making the argument has accidentally or intentionally misinterpreted some of the information in the premises. These are not valid because ideas are interpreted differently in the premises and in the conclusion. And we're also going to talk about some fallacies of sufficiency, where the premises are not enough to establish the conclusion. So they might be understood correctly, and they might be related to the conclusion, but there's just not enough there to establish the conclusion. So in the next several videos, we're going to talk about some specific examples of fallacies of these types.